The Tucson evening unfurled like a quiet promise, the sky painted with ribbons of orange and violet. In their modest South Side apartment, James "Jim" Thompson sank into a well-worn armchair, his rough hands turning the pages of a car magazine. At 40, the former Marine and mechanic carried a quiet resilience, his deep brown eyes etched with memories of Iraq and a life pieced back together. Across the small living room, Sarah Thompson, his wife of 12 years, moved to the soft pulse of jazz from a battered radio, her knife slicing through bell peppers with steady rhythm. A high school counselor, Sarah's warm smile and calm strength turned their home into a sanctuary, a defiant stand against the neighborhood's label as troubled by those who never ventured there. The aroma of sizzling onions and the promise of cornbread wafted from the stove, a small victory over the day's grind. Planning to rebuild that Chevy's engine yet, Sarah teased her eyes, dancing with mischief. Jim's low chuckle warmed the air. "One bolt at a time, babe." Their shared glance held a fragile peace, a moment they'd learned to guard fiercely. Then the world shattered. A thunderous crack split the silence, the front door bursting inward as wood splinters sprayed like shrapnel. Jim was on his feet in an instant, Marine instincts flaring before his mind could process. "Sarah, down!" he barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Sarah froze at the counter, the knife slipping from her hand, her eyes wide with shock. Before she could move, a flood of SWAT officers surged through the wreckage, black-clad figures bristling with rifles, their shouts crashing together in the cramped space. "Hands up! Get on the ground now!" One officer roared, his voice taut with adrenaline. Jim raised his hands, palms open, his heart pounding, but his training keeping him steady. Sarah, startled, reached for her phone on the counter, a desperate instinct to call for help. The motion ignited chaos. "She's got a weapon!" another officer shouted, his eyes wild behind a visor. A taser's blue arc flashed, and Sarah's sharp gasp tore through Jim like a blade. Her body convulsed as the prongs struck, and she crumpled to the linoleum, trembling uncontrollably. Rage and fear surged in Jim's chest, but he forced his voice to stay low, deadly. "That's my wife you just tased." The room stilled, the officers' rifles wavering. The lead officer badge, glinting with Carter, clenched his jaw. She reached for something, he snapped, but his gaze flickered unsteady. A younger officer muttered, "This, the dealer, right, from the tip." The word dealer landed like a punch. Their majority Black and Latino neighborhood was always that kind of place to outsiders, where assumptions wore badges and carried guns. Jim knelt beside Sarah, his hands steady despite the storm inside. "Sarah, I'm right here," he whispered, brushing a damp curl from her face. Her eyes wide with terror searched his. "Jim! What's happening?" she rasped, her voice faint over the crackle of police radios. The air was heavy with the acrid sting of burnt rubber from the taser, the apartment a chaos of splintered wood and upended furniture. "Why are you here?" Jim demanded, his stare pinning Carter. The officer shifted uncomfortably. "Warrant for this address. Suspect's a drug runner armed." Jim's eyes narrowed, his voice ice. "You got the wrong house." A radio hissed, a voice asking for address confirmation too late. Jim's mind raced. He'd faced threats in war zones, but nothing like this. His home, a battlefield, his wife shaking on the floor. "Get her medical help." Jim ordered, his tone brooking no argument. The younger officer badge, reading Ramirez, nodded, radioing for medics with a flicker of unease. Jim stayed by Sarah, his heart a war drum. "They thought we were someone else," he told her, trying to anchor them both. But it wasn't just a mix-up. The snap judgment, the taser's quick fire, the casual dealer label, it reeked of the prejudice Jim knew too well. The prolonged traffic stops, the wary glances in stores, the weight of being black in a world primed to suspect. Sirens wailed closer, red and blue lights pulsing through the shattered doorway. Paramedics hurried in their boots, crunching debris. A woman with gentle eyes knelt by Sarah. "I'm Lisa. Can you tell me your name?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Sarah Thompson." Lisa checked her vitals, her touch careful. "She's stable, but needs a hospital evaluation." Jim nodded relief, tangled with fury. As medics eased Sarah onto a stretcher, her voice broke. "Jim, I thought I was going to die." He squeezed her hand, his grip fierce. "You're safe now. I've got you." But the words felt hollow. Their trust was shattered, replaced by a raw, gnawing fear. Carter muttered about reviewing the warrant, avoiding Jim's eyes. Jim stepped closer, voice unyielding. "You hurt my wife. You broke our home. This isn't over." Outside, neighbors peeked from windows, murmurs rippling under the glare of flashing lights. Jim helped Sarah into the ambulance, his mind churning with resolve. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was a system that saw their blackness as a threat. The night was far from over, and the fight for justice had just begun. The hospital waiting room was a cold, sterile box, its fluorescent lights buzzing like a swarm of trapped flies. Jim Thompson sat beside Sarah, his calloused hand enveloping hers as she clutched a thin hospital gown, her tremors barely eased by the blanket draped over her shoulders. The chaos of the raid still echoed in their minds, the splintered door, the taser's cruel arc, the officers' shouted assumptions. Sarah's eyes, usually bright with resolve, were clouded with fear, her breath uneven. Jim's jaw was tight, his marine discipline holding back a tide of rage. At 40, he'd faced danger before, but this, his wife hurt. Their home violated was a wound no training could prepare him for. A nurse bustled past her clipboard, a shield against the couple's silent anguish. They said it was a mistake. Sarah whispered, her voice fragile, but it didn't feel like one. Jim squeezed her hand, his voice low. "It wasn't just a mistake, Sarah. They saw us and assumed the worst." The memory of the officer's muttered dealer stung, a reminder of the racial lens that had turned their home into a target. The sliding doors hissed open, and a police detective approached, his badge gleaming under the harsh lights. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson." "I'm Detective Harris," he said, his tone professional but cautious, like a man stepping through a minefield. "I'm here to discuss the incident at your apartment." Jim's eyes narrowed. "Incident? You mean the part where your SWAT team broke down our door and tased my wife?" Harris shifted, glancing at his notepad. "We're reviewing the warrant. It appears there was an error in the address. The team was targeting a suspected dealer in your area." Sarah's voice, though soft, cut through. "Our area? You mean our neighborhood, where people like us live?" Harris hesitated, his discomfort palpable. "The tip came from a reliable source, but we're looking into why the address was wrong." Jim leaned forward, his voice steel. "A tip based on what? That we're black and live on the south side. You didn't verify it, and now my wife's in a hospital gown." Harris's face tightened, but he didn't contradict. "We're investigating," he said, the words hollow. "We want to ensure this doesn't happen again." Sarah's eyes glistened. "It already happened to us." The detective's assurances did little to mend the fracture in their world. Back at their apartment, the wreckage greeted them like a fresh wound, shattered door frame, overturned chairs, the faint burn of taser residue in the air. Sarah sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. "I keep seeing it, Jim. The guns, the shouting." He knelt before her, his hands steadying hers. "I know, baby. I see it too." But his mind churned with more than trauma, years of microaggressions from suspicious cops to sidelong glances crystallized in that raid. This wasn't just a clerical error, it was a system that profiled them as threats. Determined to fight, Jim contacted a lawyer recommended by a friend from his Marine days. Lisa Bennett, a sharp-eyed attorney with a reputation for taking on police misconduct, met them in a cluttered downtown office. "This isn't isolated," she said, her voice matter-of-fact. "I've seen cases like yours, black families targeted on flimsy warrants, assumptions rooted in race. The department's reliable tips often mean stereotypes." She slid a leaked police report across the desk, showing the warrant was based on a vague description, male black 3050 South Side. Jim's stomach twisted. That could be half the neighborhood. Lisa's eyes met theirs. "You have a strong case, but it won't be easy. They'll deflect, maybe retaliate." Sarah nodded, her counselor's resolve flickering. "We can't let this slide. Not for us. Not for anyone else." Jim agreed, but unease gnawed at him. The system Lisa described wasn't just broken. It was built to protect itself. That night, as they tried to reclaim their home, a new shock awaited. Tucked under the apartment's welcome mat was a folded note, its scrawled words chilling, "Keep quiet, or you'll regret it." Jim's pulse quickened, his fingers tightening around the paper. Sarah's eyes widened, her voice barely a whisper. "Who would do this?" Jim scanned the dark street outside, the flashing police lights of the raid replaced by an eerie stillness. "Someone who wants us scared," he said, his voice steady, but laced with fury. The note wasn't just a threat, it was a gauntlet. Jim tucked it into his pocket, evidence for Lisa, and pulled Sarah close. "They think they can silence us," he said, his Marine grit resurfacing. "They're wrong." Sarah's trembling hands steadied against him, her fear hardening into defiance. "We'll fight, Jim. For us, for everyone they've hurt." But as they stood in their broken home, the weight of the battle loomed. The system that had targeted them was circling, and the fight for justice was about to get uglier. The Tucson sun beat down on the community center, its cracked parking lot buzzing with restless energy. Inside, Jim and Sarah Thompson stood at a makeshift podium, the weight of 100 eyes pressing against them. 2 weeks had passed since the SWAT team's raid on their apartment, leaving Sarah's body bruised and their trust shattered. The threatening note, "Keep quiet, or you'll regret it," still burned in Jim's mind, tucked away as evidence for their lawyer, Lisa Bennett. But silence wasn't an option. Tonight's town hall, organized with local activists, was their first step to demand answers and reform, to turn their pain into a beacon for change. Jim adjusted the microphone, his Marine discipline steadying his nerves. At 40, he was no stranger to high-stakes moments, but this felt different, raw, personal. Sarah, her counselor's poise masking lingering tremors, squeezed his hand. "We're doing this for everyone," she whispered. Jim nodded, his deep voice carrying as he began. "Our home was invaded. My wife was tased, all because of a wrong address and assumptions about who we are." The crowd, neighbors, teachers, activists, murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Sarah spoke next, her voice soft but unyielding. "We're not just fighting for us. This is about every family who's been profiled, who's feared the badge meant to protect them." Her words landed heavily, especially among the Black and Latino residents who filled half the room. A leaked police report shared by Lisa had fueled their outrage. The warrant for their apartment stemmed from a vague tip about a black male South Side possible dealer. No name, no evidence, just a stereotype that nearly cost Sarah her life. But not everyone was swayed. A white retiree in the back, his arms crossed, stood up. "Look, mistakes happen. Cops have tough jobs. Why make this about race?" Murmurs rippled, some in agreement. Jim's jaw tightened, but Sarah responded, her tone measured. "It's about race when the system targets our neighborhood, our skin without question. That's not a mistake. It's a pattern. The room split, tension crackling like static. Online, the divide grew uglier. Trolls flooded local forums accusing Jim and Sarah of playing the race card or fabricating the raid's severity. One post dripping with venom read, "They're just stirring trouble." Typical. The racism wasn't new to Jim traffic stops that lingered store clerks who hovered, but seeing it weaponized against their pain cut deep. Sarah, scrolling through the comments at home, slammed her laptop shut. "They don't know us," she said, tears brimming. Jim pulled her close. "They don't have to. We're telling the truth." Hope came unexpectedly. An anonymous whistleblower, likely the same source as the note's warning, sent Lisa internal police emails revealing a pattern of rushed warrants targeting minority neighborhoods. "Pressure to act fast, no time to verify," one officer wrote. The news broke on a local station, sparking protests outside City Hall. Jim and Sarah joined, holding signs reading, "Justice for all and end racial profiling." The crowd's chants echoed, but so did the glares from counter-protesters across the street, their signs blaring, "Back the Blue." The standoff came to a head outside their apartment complex, where a rally for the Thompsons drew hundreds. As Sarah spoke to the crowd, her voice steady. "We demand accountability, not excuses." A group of counter-protesters surged forward shouting, "Cops, keep us safe." One man, red-faced, yelled, "Go back to your ghetto." Jim stepped in front of Sarah, his body a shield as police formed a line between the groups. A bottle sailed through the air, shattering near Jim's feet. The crowd gasped, some scattering, others standing firm. Sarah grabbed the megaphone, her voice cutting through the chaos. "We won't be silenced. Not by hate, not by fear." The police dispersed the crowd, but the moment galvanized their allies. Neighbors who'd stayed silent now shared stories of profiling a traffic stop, turned hostile a teenager frisked for looking suspicious. At their apartment, Jim and Sarah sifted through messages of support, but the threats lingered. Another note appeared, slipped under their door, "Last warning. Stop, now." Jim's pulse raced, but Sarah's eyes hardened. "They're scared we're being heard," she said. Lisa called that night, her voice urgent. "The emails are just the start. We're building a case, but the department's circling wagons. Stay vigilant." Jim hung up his Marine grit, locking in. The standoff had shown the city's fault lines, those who saw their pain and those who denied it. But it also showed their strength. "We're not alone," he told Sarah, her hand in his. "And we're not stopping." The fight was growing, but so was the danger, and the truth they sought was still buried in shadows. The Tucson night pressed against the Thompsons' apartment, the repaired door a flimsy shield against the weight of their battle. 3 months had passed since the SWAT team's raid, but the scars lingered. Sarah's nightmares of flashing guns, Jim's simmering anger that threatened to boil over. The community's support, sparked by their town hall, and the protest standoff was a lifeline, but the cost was steep. Jim sat at the kitchen table, his hands clenched around a coffee mug, staring at the latest threat, their car's windshield smashed. Overnight, the word "troublemakers" scrawled in red paint across the hood. The vandalism reeking of racial venom was a fresh wound in a fight that felt endless. Sarah, her counselor's poise fraying, stood by the window, her arms crossed. "I can't sleep, Jim," she admitted, her voice cracking. "Every time I close my eyes, I feel the taser again." At 38, she'd always been the steady one guiding students through crises, but now her own trauma loomed like a shadow. Jim rose, pulling her into a hug, his Marine strength a quiet anchor. "I know, baby. I'm struggling too." His anger at the police, the vandals himself, for not shielding her, gnawed at him, a beast he barely controlled. Their lawyer, Lisa Bennett, had warned of pushback, but the reality was brutal. A leaked body cam video aired on local news the previous week had reignited their fight, and their pain. The footage from the raid captured Officer Carter muttering a racial slur as Sarah lay trembling, another officer laughing. The public's outrage was swift, with protests swelling outside City Hall, but so was the backlash. Online trolls branded Jim and Sarah liars, exploiting the video, while a police union statement called it an isolated incident. The slur cut deepest, a confirmation of the bias Jim had sensed that night, the assumption that their blackness made them targets. The vandalism wasn't random. Lisa's investigation, fueled by the whistleblower's emails, uncovered a pattern minority families hit by similar mistaken raids, their complaints buried. But a new revelation shook Jim to his core. Lisa called that morning, her voice low. "We've got evidence of a cover-up." A deputy chief, Richard Vaughn, pressured the warrant team to act fast. Knowing the tip was shaky, he wanted results to boost his record. Jim's pulse quickened. He knew it could be wrong. Lisa's silence was answer enough. "We're filing a civil rights lawsuit, Jim." But Vaughn's connected. This could get uglier. Ugly arrived that afternoon. Returning from a community meeting, Jim found their mailbox defaced with a racial slur, the same red paint as their car. Sarah's hands shook as she scrubbed it off, tears falling. "Why do they hate us for telling the truth?" she asked. Jim had no answer, only a growing dread that their fight was unraveling them. He snapped at a neighbor's innocent question, withdrew from friends, and doubted his strength. Was he failing Sarah, their community? Desperate for perspective, Jim called Marcus Hayes, his old Marine buddy, now a counselor in Phoenix. Over the phone, Marcus's voice was steady, familiar. "You're in a war, man, just not the kind we trained for. This anger, this pain, it's real, but don't let it own you." Jim exhaled, confessing, "I'm losing it, Marcus. The threats, the slurs, it's too much." Marcus paused, then said, "You're not just fighting for you. You're fighting for every kid in your neighborhood who could be next. Channel that rage. Get strategic." The words hit like a lifeline, pulling Jim back from the edge. That night, Jim and Sarah sat with their therapist, a soft-spoken woman who'd helped them navigate the trauma. "You've been through hell," she said. "Acknowledge the pain, but lean on your resilience. You're stronger together." Sarah nodded, her eyes clearing. "I want to keep going for our students, our neighbors." Jim squeezed her hand, Marcus's advice echoing, "We'll fight smarter, not just harder." The next day, Lisa shared more whistleblower documents. Vaughn had buried complaints about racial profiling for years. The evidence was dynamite, but dangerous. As Jim and Sarah prepared for a press conference to expose the cover-up, their resolve hardened. The vandalism, the slurs, the threats, they were attacks on their truth, but also proof they were shaking the system. "They're scared," Jim said, his voice firm. "Good. They should be." Sarah's smile, though weary, held fire. "We're not backing down." But the fight was far from won. The lawsuit loomed. Vaughn's influence cast a long shadow, and the scars of that night pulsed beneath their courage. They were at a breaking point, but also a turning point, ready to face whatever came next. The Tucson spring sun cast a golden glow over the community park, where laughter and music mingled with the scent of grilled food. 6 months had passed since the SWAT team's raid on Jim and Sarah Thompson's apartment, a night that had shattered their home and ignited a movement. Today's festival, organized by neighbors and activists, celebrated the changes their courage had sparked: new police policies, a settled lawsuit, and a city reckoning with its biases. Jim stood near a stage, his arm around Sarah, their faces tired but proud. At 40, Jim's Marine resilience had carried them through. At 38, Sarah's counselor's heart had kept them grounded. Yet the scars of that night and the fight that followed lingered like shadows. The lawsuit, led by their lawyer, Lisa Bennett, had exposed Deputy Chief Richard Vaughn's cover-up of racial profiling in warrant processes. The leaked body cam video, with its damning racial slurs and whistleblower documents, had forced accountability. Vaughn resigned, 2 officers faced discipline, and the department adopted stricter verification protocols. The settlement covered their legal fees, home repairs, and therapy, but no amount could erase the trauma, the vandalism, the threatening notes, the slur-painted car. Still, Jim and Sarah had turned their pain into purpose, speaking at national forums on police reform, their story a beacon for change. On stage, a councilwoman took the microphone, her voice clear. "Thanks to Jim and Sarah Thompson, we're building a safer, fairer Tucson. Their fight showed us that justice starts with truth." The crowd, black, Latino, white, young, old, cheered, holding signs reading, "End profiling" and "Community strong." Sarah squeezed Jim's hand, her eyes shining. "We did this together," she whispered. Jim nodded, but his gaze scanned the crowd, alert for the resistance Lisa had warned of. Not everyone embraced change. That resistance surfaced subtly. As the festival wound down, a plainclothes officer approached his badge, discreet but visible. "Mr. Thompson," he said, his tone polite, but edged some folks in the department aren't happy with the new rules. "You've made life harder for good cops." Jim's jaw tightened, recognizing the veiled threat. The officer's eyes flicked to Sarah, then back. "Just saying things could get complicated if you keep pushing." Sarah's breath caught, but Jim stepped forward, his Marine grit unyielding. "We're not stopping. You want to threaten us? Do it in the open. We've faced worse." The officer backed off, disappearing into the crowd, but the encounter rattled them. It was a reminder that systemic change met resistance, even after victories. Back home, Jim and Sarah sat on their porch, the repaired door a symbol of their resilience. "They're scared of what we've started," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the fear. Jim nodded. "Good. Let them be. We've got a community behind us." Healing came in small moments. Sarah returned to counseling her students' energy, a balm for her nightmares. She started a school program on community trust, teaching kids to demand respect. Jim mentored youth at a local center, his Marine discipline guiding boys who'd faced profiling. Therapy helped them process the trauma, Sarah's panic, Jim's rage, rebuilding their bond. Neighbors brought meals, shared stories, and joined their advocacy, a network of support that held them up. One evening, as they watched the city lights from their porch, Jim reflected. "That night, I thought we'd lost everything, but it showed me we're stronger than I knew." Sarah leaned against him, her smile soft. "It's more than us now. It's about every family who's been silenced, every kid who deserves better." Their journey had been brutal, the raid, the slurs, the threats, but it had forged a purpose. They weren't just survivors. They were change-makers. Their final message came at a national reform conference where they spoke to a packed room. Jim's voice was firm. "Don't stay quiet. When you see injustice, speak. Support the hurting. Demand better from those in power." Sarah added, "Behind every story is a family, a home, a life. Racism thrives in silence. Break it." The applause was thunderous, their words a call to action. As they stood together, hands clasped, the scars remained, but so did hope. Tucson was changing slowly, imperfectly, but every voice raised, every policy shifted, was a step. Jim and Sarah knew the fight wasn't over, but they'd shown what was possible when a community stood united. To listeners, their story was a challenge. Confront bias, build trust, be the change. Because when voices rise together, no system is too broken to fix, and no wound too deep to heal.